Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1500 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. Today we have a Caro Kann Advanced Variation, and we're going to play pawn to c5. I actually had one of the guys that I coach ask me about this d4 pawn in the Caro Kann, and basically saying that it's really difficult for him to get rid of it. And I sent him a very long voice note explaining how to combat this. And the basic idea is that you play c5 to challenge the pawn. If the white pawn takes, in this particular position, it's technically a gambit, but you can delay it for later on if you prefer. But c5 will be played at some point to undermine this d4 pawn, apply more pressure with knight to c6. And the kind of situation that we want is something like knight to f3, take, and the d4 pawn becomes isolated because it loses its c3 partner, and we can just apply loads and loads of pressure to it. But okay, my opponent goes bishop to b5, pinning my knight to my king. Now the question is, can I remember what I'm supposed to do? I think I'm supposed to take. So let's take. Yeah, take back like that. And as I said, we get rid of the c pawn. And now this d4 pawn could become kind of weak. Now, something tells me maybe queen a5 is a move, but this is also very reasonable. We could go bishop to d7, which threatens knight takes e5, which is a nice little tactic. You could, of course, play e6, but then your bishop gets blocked in. You could also go bishop f5, maybe? Maybe? I think I like bishop d7, though. Queen to b6 hitting the bishop kind of just is asking for knight to c3, defending the bishop and hitting the d5 pawn, so that doesn't really make any sense. My opponent takes. Let's take back with the bishop. Taking back with the pawn doesn't make any sense to me, because one, this is a weak pawn, because it's a backwards pawn, and there's an open c-file against it. A backwards pawn, so if I were to have taken with the pawn here, a backwards pawn would be a pawn with nothing next to it that can guard it, right? The only pawn next to it is a d pawn, which is advanced further, and there's often an open file against it, and the square in front is controlled by your opponent. All of those criteria would be met, and the c6 pawn would be incredibly weak. So we take with a bishop to e3. And here we have a relatively pleasant position. We have the bishop pair, and we will work to apply pressure to this d4 pawn in the future. We don't necessarily have to win the d4 pawn. We can play around the d4 pawn, but we can apply pressure with moves like knight e7, knight f5, queen to b6 maybe. This bishop can't do a whole lot to attack the pawn. It mostly goes to e7 and just surveys the dark squares, considering we've got all our central pawns on light squares. Queen b6 is a reasonable move, but I think I'll start with e6, preparing this knight maneuver, bishop e7, and castles. We also have the bishop pair, which is just good in general. Also, if my opponent goes knight to f3, we could consider bishop to b5, trying to stop white from castling, right? Because we control the f1 square. Something like knight f3, bishop f5, knight c3, hitting the bishop, bishop a6. Moves like queen to a4 are very annoying, because we'll be vacating this diagonal. And also, I mean, we just help white develop with tempo, so it seems unnecessary. Knight c3, let's go knight e7. In the long run, we should have an advantage based on the fact that we have the bishop pair, which is very nice. And this kind of knight maneuver is very, very typical of the advanced variation in the Caro Kann, because you apply pressure to d4, obviously, and this bishop often comes to e3 to defend d4, so you also apply pressure to the bishop. And there's many cases where you'll take this bishop and you'll have a bishop pair versus a pair of knights, which, if you can open up the position, should favor the black pieces, right? Because a bishop pair works very well in open positions. Also, if you've been keeping up with the speedrun, I think 2 of our last 3 games we've faced cheaters, which has been very frustrating, but both of them were banned very quickly. So I have to give credit to chess.com there. They acted very quickly on my reports. And the second one especially wasn't all that obvious. I mean, I was 100% sure he was cheating, but it wasn't as obvious as just playing the computer move every single move like the first one was. So, gotta give some credit to chess.com there. I don't think the answer to the cheating problem is necessarily for everybody to just go to Lichess. I've got no problem with Lichess, but I don't see how that would fix the cheating problem at all, right? Let's go bishop to e7. This is kind of an ideal placement for the bishop because we, of course, have a lot of light squared control with this kind of pyramid. And that means that the dark squares, I mean, white obviously controls the dark squares in the center quite well. The dark squares are where this battle is going to be fought, potentially. They're just the weaker squares. So our bishop on e7 just monitors all of the dark squares around my light squared center, which is great. Pawn to a4, okay. This isn't a threat, I'll just play a6. b4 can't be played, we control that. So we could play a5, but then we give away the b5 square, right? So don't automatically play a5 because your opponent played a4. If your opponent pushes a flank pawn, you don't have to copy them, right? b4 can't be played. That's fine. If my opponent goes a5, maybe he could try to get the knight into the dark squares. To be honest, though, that seems like a very long-winded plan for what it is. Also, I know I can take this bishop and double the pawns. Now he could take with the rook if he wants to. But this knight is way better than this bishop. I mean, the bishop, what does it do? It looks at these two squares, basically, right? Which my knight also does. However, my knight can also see way more than this bishop can see, right? h4 is quite a useful square, because if g4, for example, kicking the knight, we have knight h4 trying to apply pressure to this knight, which can be quite useful. So I don't really want to trade off this bishop for this knight, at least not yet. There doesn't seem like there's a point to doing that. We could go queen to b6 now, applying pressure to b2. If a move like b3, that's just a very weak pawn, which is fine by me. And of course, b4 can't be played. If queen c2 defending, then rook c8 looks pretty good, lining up the rook with the queen. That has to be good. Although we are maybe encouraging a5 with tempo, which probably isn't good because he could maybe play a6 to undermine our light squares. And I don't want to let him play a6. f6 can be a consideration in some of these positions, but we don't really have enough pressure on e5. It's incredibly well defended, and the rook could open up on the e6 pawn, which would be very, very weak. So I don't like that. We could consider queen a5, just stopping the advancement. I still don't know what that really does. I'm going to start with rook c8, just because this is clearly a very active square for the rook to be on. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. And then we can figure out what to do with the rest of our pieces. Arguably, this bishop isn't amazing. Maybe a4 was simply played to restrict my bishop's movement. But in the long run, it could be a useful piece, right? Like, it doesn't have to be doing anything insane right now, because the game's still sort of opening up. Like, this is where a lot of people struggle, and a lot of you watching will struggle in this sort of part of the game, where we have a middle game. Neither side is really going to be attacking the other side's king. I mean, white doesn't have the important light squared bishop. He has no kind of pawn storm unless he goes g4, in which case, I mean, I just have knight h4, and that's that. I have no kingside attack, because clearly I'm focused on the queen side here. It's also the way my pawns are pointing, which is often a good indication of where you should focus your attention. Obviously, that is not 100% of the time, but it can be a very good indication. So it's one of those middle games where, like, there's not a clear and obvious plan for either side to go for. Like, from the white perspective, I don't know. He's trying to expand on the queen side a bit, but a move like a5 to me feels like an overextension of the position. I mean, something like bishop to b4, and it's like, how are you actually defending this pawn? Unless you play, I suppose, pawn to a6. So then it's like, okay, if a5, I go a6, preparing bishop to b4. And how are you defending this? Like, you just can't. If something like a4, a6, knight to a4, trying to come into b6, I can literally just take. And it doesn't matter that there's discoveries on my queen, because the knight can't go anywhere useful. If it goes to b6, I'll take it. If it goes to c5, I mean, I'll just move my queen, and you're not threatening anything. So, like I said, it's one of those middle games where there's no clear and obvious plan for either side. Queen b3 is interesting. Okay. Obviously, b7 isn't a target. That much is clear. It does, however, maybe prepare pawn to a5, because I no longer have bishop to b4, because that's controlled by the queen. Again, I don't like pawn a5 for myself, because it invites the knight into b5, which is a good square. I could take the bishop, but I also don't see how that helps. The bishop sucks. Maybe now I go queen to a5. If bishop to d2, lining up with my queen, maybe queen to a6? Perhaps? Maybe preparing something like bishop d7, rook c4, rook fc8. That's interesting. Queen b6 doesn't make sense to me, because after the trade and a5, white seems to open up the position in his favor, and I don't want to allow that, really. So, yeah, queen a5, I think I like that. We stop the advancement, and the only way that white can kind of make this happen is to force my queen away, and the only piece that can really do that is this dark-squared bishop by dropping back to d2, which also could lead to potentially winning the d4 pawn in the future, because it would only be protected once, which is a nice byproduct. Not immediately, but like it could be fruitful later on. As I said way earlier on in the video, and as I said to my student, this d4 pawn, it can become so weak in these positions, right? Not immediately. Like, we're playing around the pawn for the time being, but in the future, this pawn can't be defended by another pawn. That's the whole issue. Okay, I don't really understand knight b5, because you're just inviting the move a6. And I don't really understand... Is it knight a7? Is that the point? Forking these? That's actually pretty funny. What about if I go queen b6, though? Pinning the knight to the queen. That looks very nice. Now, I could technically take, doubling the white b-pawns, but how do I defend a7? I'm not going to play rook a8. That's an incredibly passive move. And I have no other good way of defending the pawn. So I actually think queen b6 is a really strong move here, because the knight is weak, the queen is weak, and the b2 pawn is weak. If a5, I just take the knight. And obviously, a7 is well defended. Yeah, okay, queen d3, but now I can just boot the knight out. And this is starting to look really nice. Really nice. As I said, if white tries to play on the queen side, it could be an overextension of the position. And I think, as we've seen, it has been an overextension of the position. I think our bishop pair in particular, and also our rook on the open c-file, lends to the idea that we have better control of the queen side than white does. And also, as I said, kind of the way that our pawns are pointing, like our central pawn chain is pointing to the queen side, can often be a good indication of where you should focus your efforts. And now, I mean, if the white knight jumps in, like, I would just do take, and I'll be up a pawn. Like, I mean, maybe you can play knight e5, and if I were to trade, then, I mean, you can try and play that position with opposite-coloured bishops, but also note the b2 pawn hangs in lots of these lines. So white has to be very careful. More than likely, a move like knight to c3 will be played, and the question is, can we take on b2? I don't think so, because after rook e2 b1, the queen just looks trapped. So I probably can't take the b2 pawn. But there's no good place to put the b2 pawn anyway. If knight back to c3, firstly, it's completely dominated, right? It can't go anywhere forwards, which is great news, obviously. And it does go back. Like I said, taking, we're just going to get our queen trapped, so let's not get our queen trapped. If a5 is played, I mean, I can play a move like queen to b4, maybe. I can even just drop the queen back. Even to a7 wouldn't be ludicrous. Just keeping an eye on the d4 pawn. We could double up on the c file. That would be a valid idea. We could take the bishop. Taking the bishop is actually interesting. Because if rook takes, then we can take on b2. Because if here I have this, and I think I escape. If queen takes, though, and I take, then this is still a problem. Oh, no, I have c2. I have the c2 square, then. And I can evacuate this way. Ooh, yeah, no, this looks really strong. And if pawn takes, then, of course, you're just damaging your own structure. Yeah, that looks really good. That looks like a good time to take. I think that, yeah, pawn takes has to be played, realistically. Queen to b3 looks like an interesting move. If knight to d2, take again, we're getting our queen trapped, so that's no good. We could play bishop back to d7, which is a very cool idea, where the point is that now we are going to take on b2, because then if rook to b1, the knight is hanging, because we open up lines of attack against it. We could also play bishop to b4, pinning the knight, but then we cut our queen off from b2, which I don't really want to do. If bishop d7, I need to be a little bit concerned about pawn to e4, but again, we can take, and you don't have time for this because I'll take here. And that's, you know, that's just not enough. That's not enough for white. So I like bishop d7. And if white defends the b pawn with a move like rook e to b1, I mean, these rooks are very passive, in my opinion, just sitting behind these pawns, whereas my rook is, of course, on an open file. As we can see, as I kind of said earlier in the game, you can get these positions where you have the bishop pair versus the knight pair. And for the time being, the center is obviously very locked up. So, in theory, the knights should have a fighting chance against the bishops, because the bishops are less powerful, particularly my light squared bishop, because it can't actually see that many things, right? It's pretty passive in comparison to this bishop, which can see a lot of things, which is kind of the potential issue with having so many pawns on light squares, is that it restricts my own light squared bishop. But, as I said, by doubling the white e-pawns, it kind of invites the move e4. And whilst that may be a good move in many positions, for example, after some kind of trade, our bishop could then go to c6 and even into d5 and actually be a very effective piece, looking at a lot of different things. So white has to be careful with opening up the position. So, okay, queen d2, defending b2, makes sense. I love the idea of queen b3, because now, obviously, there's no rook a3 because of this, and there's no knight to d2 because the queen is on d2. Now, the question is, if queen b3, what's our threat? Well, bishop b4, I think, is the idea, applying a ton of pressure to this knight. However, can white get away with pawn to e4 in that position? I'm also taking eyes off of d4 by moving my queen, right? Although d4 is very well defended. So, queen b3, pawn e4, I think I have to take. If knight takes, then I have rook c2, which should be winning. So the rook would have to take, which I don't think is that good. Because after rook takes, a move like bishop to c6 looks good, but also just bishop to b4 looks good. So let's go queen b3. Also, one of the ideas is that I do want to play bishop b4. But if I play it here, firstly, there's not as much pressure on the knight, because my queen would be applying pressure. But also, it relieves the pressure on b2, which I don't want to do. right? We need to ensure that we're not sacrificing the activity of one of our pieces, i.e. the queen, for the activity of another piece if we can help it. Queen b3 is also good because we restrict this pawn's movement forever. As long as our queen remains here, this pawn can't move. We also take away the c2 square from the queen, which is potentially useful because it would allow this knight to come to d2 to kick our queen away. And as I said, we have to keep an eye on e4, but if takes, you can't take with the knight because of rook c2. And if e4 take and rook take, I'm not convinced that's a good idea, to be honest. Also, queen b3, don't forget, this a4 pawn could hang. Currently, it is defended twice, sure. But a move like rook c4, for example, and maybe we're just threatening to take the pawn. Not even b2, but a4. And through our middle game play, I mean, you can see how secure all of our pawns are, right? Compare that to white's pawns. You know, a very weak e3 pawn, a very weak b2 pawn, a very weak a4 pawn. It's very different. So now the question becomes, do we even want to play bishop to b4 anymore? Would we rather go rook to c4 and just go after a4? And if pawn to a5, then bishop to b4 with more of a threat, because one, we're hitting a5, two, we're pinning the knight, and the rook is already on c4, so we're preparing to double up. That looks really strong to me. We do, however, have to watch out for knight d2 ideas if we go rook to c4. So, for example, rook c4, queen to d3 might be quite strong for white because it prepares knight d2. So we don't have time for this because of knight to d2, and we get forked. So not an easy answer. I think bishop b4 is the move I'm going to go for because it makes it very hard for white to move. And this pawn is still weak. This pawn is still weak. And we're maybe just going to go rook c7, rook f to c8. We could maybe try and go f6, but it feels a bit artificial in this position. At the end of the day, the center is locked up. You can't go e4 because you can't take back because the queen hangs, right? And so the king side is obviously closed up. The f-file is not useful for white because, I mean, f7 is very well defended. The center is locked up, but the queen side is where the play is happening. So opening up a second front sometimes can be a good idea to create like multiple weaknesses. But here, I feel like it's better for us to keep our focus on the queen side. Although, having said that, maybe f6 is stronger now because this knight no longer defends e5. Which is fair. Is fair. Although maybe now rook to c4 is strong because this knight can't come to d2 anymore. I mean, I assume the knight's trying to come to d3 to kick our bishop, but we can just go bishop back to a5. That's not a problem. That does allow rook to a3 in some positions, though, although we do have queen back to b6. Very interesting. I think rook c4 is the logical continuation of the position. I do think it is. So let's play it. Rook c4. We're trying to play rook f2 c8 and just apply 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers to the knight. And our bishop, as I said before, isn't the best piece in the world, but it's not terrible. Also, I just realized we can't actually do this because of knight to c5. Yeah, that's not great. So maybe we just have to go rook f to c8 and give this bishop up, which I don't really want to do, but I don't see an alternative. Well, no, actually, we can go bishop e7. And if knight c5, we just take it and win a pawn. So maybe we should just drop back. We can always come back into the position in the future. And there's no e4 because, at the very least, d4 hangs. So this pin is not necessary. Yeah, also, I like bishop e7 because we keep an eye on the a3 square, which was a very nice prediction because my opponent just blundered his rook. Yeah, I mean, a big reason I was keeping the bishop on this diagonal is because the queen on b3 is very, very strong. And this should lead to a victory. Because after pawn takes, I'm not even going to take this pawn. I'm going to go rook f to c8. And there is way too much pressure down the c-file now. It's completely unbearable for white. And I mean you have the c5 square actually. Oh, oh wait, have I just blundered? Have I just blundered? Wait. Oh, I actually might have. Because my queen can't move to a square that protects the bishop. Oh, wow. I guess I have to sack my rook. Yeah, yeah. But it's okay. It's okay. It's really not that big a deal. To be honest, this might even be a easier way to win this. Because white's pawns are completely ruined. We're up a pawn, and his pawns are just so bad. Absolutely horrific. A3 is still very much hanging. I mean, maybe we could have even taken here first to apply more pressure to the rook. Maybe. But I don't think it matters all that much. But okay, yeah, I completely missed knight to c5 in fairness. Okay. Okay, knight back to b1. All right. Offering me a rook trade. Interesting. So if take. The queen doesn't have queen c8 mate. So maybe after take, I can just take on a4. And if queen c7, just queen c6. That looks good to me. That looks good. Obviously, I've got to be a little bit careful of being back rank mated, but I think I'm fine here. So, okay, queen take... I mean, I could just be more simple and play this. Queen c4, effectively forcing a queen trade. Knight c3, blockading the pawn and defending a4. And then we're up a pawn in a knight versus bishop endgame, where the bishop should be better. Oh, and also I could just march in... I could go g5 and march into f5 and e5 to pick up the e5 pawn, which is quite nice. Yeah, I think that probably makes a lot of sense. Let's play queen c4. He could go queen to c3, which would be an interesting move, because if take, then take. Basically, white wants to trade on his terms. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Decline the queen trade. Let's just go bishop c6. Keep things nice and simple. We might have ideas of d4 opening this up in the future. Yeah, okay. You can do that. Let's invade. Queen to d3, trying to put pressure on as many things as I possibly can. Okay, now white offers me a queen trade. Take. We, of course, fixed the white pawn structure, but I actually don't care. I don't care because we go up another pawn. So now it's 2 pawns that we are up. And I don't know how the white knight really does anything here. I mean, it's almost completely locked off. Yeah, let's bring in the king. Now I'm going to play this very cool move, bishop d1. The idea being that I'm trying to prevent the knight from coming into the game. Obviously, my pawn stops this, and my bishop stops this. Okay. Let's go pawn to f6. Now that the king is distracted over here, I'm going to try and create a passed pawn in the center. And the important bit is the knight can't come to f3, because I'll just take it. My bishop's just trying to dominate this knight with the help of the pawn. And now we can just push here. There's also no g4. Okay, yeah, that's fine. If here... Oh, then we have check. That's quite nice. Yeah, we can probably bait that out, to be honest. That'd be a nice trick, and I think he might fall for it. If he doesn't do this, then we just push. Or we go king to d5, right? Yeah, that's not a problem. I mean, this pawn technically dominates both of my pawns, but it's kind of beside the point right now. It's not a big deal at all. Let's grab this. There's no check because of this, obviously. And my opponent resigns. So, GG. Very interesting game. Yeah, so we made a mistake, which I'm going to assume was allowing knight to c5, which was a complete oversight from me, but it happens. It happens. Let's get into the analysis. Let's see what the computer has to say. Okay, so 83.7% accuracy for my opponent, 90.3 for myself. So a very accurate game. Let's get into it. And also, the mistake was not what I thought it was. So stick around and I'll show you what the mistake actually was. Because rook c5 was actually good. So, okay. E4, c6, d4, d5, e5, and pawn to c5. As I said, white can take here, and the idea is to gambit the pawn, but these pawns are very weak, so we will most likely win one of them back. But my opponent goes pawn c3, we go knight c6, applying more pressure, and we have bishop to b5. I take on d4, cd4, and as we saw, this d4 pawn did become relatively weak later on in the game, but white also had to commit resources to defending it, such as bishop to e3 and knight to f3, and we could kind of work around that pawn while keeping some kind of pressure on it to keep the white pieces occupied. So here I go bishop d7, which is actually a bit of a mistake. Bishop to f5 is apparently the move. And after bishop takes, b takes, and something like knight c3, we, I suppose, just build up for c5 again. Let's say bishop b3, rook b8, pawn b3. Okay, yeah. And then I guess knight e7 castles, and then maybe we'll build up for c5. But bishop d7, I'm kind of setting a threat here. So if white plays a move like knight f3, then I have knight takes e5. This is a common tactic that you need to be aware of. If you take, then I take, and the d-pawn is protected, and I'm up a pawn. And if you take, then I take with the knight, and I am again up a pawn, right? So my opponent takes, and we take back with the bishop, bishop e3. You can take back with the pawn and go for c5 in the future, but to me it feels easier to take with the bishop. I suppose taking back with the pawn, the justification would be bishop f... No, it would be to lock the bishop in. And after this, trying to clamp down, we go c5 anyway. Knight c5, here. Queen a5, queen d2. Why queen d2? Why not bishop d2? No, that's also fine. Okay, whatever. I'm not going to pretend to try to understand. But bishop c6, bishop e3, and we go pawn to e6, preparing the rest of our development. And here we just have a very comfortable position. It's kind of an ideal Caro Kann. Knight e7, knight f3, knight f5, keeping an eye on the bishop. This is normal placement of the pieces. And then we go bishop to e7. Sorry, give me a second. Sorry about that. Yeah, so my opponent castles. We go bishop to e7. And as I said, with so many of our pawns on light squares, and to be fair, our bishop is kind of a big pawn right now, the dark squared bishop is very important to be monitoring the rest of the dark squares, which our pawns are not attending to. So pawn a4. Here, I didn't like pawn to a5 because I thought that knight to b5 could come at some point. For the time being, the computer doesn't care. It wants to do this and then castle and claims this is weak. I suppose we do have the move b6 if we need it. And a5 is very well protected and b5 is quite weak and also there's no pawn to b4. But I didn't see a need. I didn't see a need to play a5, so I castled. Rook e1, rook c8, just improving the positioning of the rook. Computer also liked bishop back to d7. And why? Let's say my opponent does nothing. Rook c8. Let's say he continues to do nothing. It really wants to put the rook on c4. And if knight to d2, knight e3, you can't take because of take, or just take. So fe3. And it wants to put the rook on b4. Huh. I've never seen that kind of maneuver before in this opening. But here it makes a lot of sense because our rook can't really get trapped because we can just trade rooks. Interesting. But rook c8 is good. Queen b3. We go queen a5. Knight takes is better if rook takes, which I considered. Then queen a5. I suppose the point is bishop d2, which I was expecting. And then what was my plan? Oh, my plan was queen to a6, which the computer does like. It does like. So this was my idea. Knight b5, though, and we go queen b6, which is the best move. Pawn a6 isn't quite as good because of knight to a7. A very weird move, but our pawn moving forward disconnects our queen from a7. And after something like rook b8, take, queen c2, we are technically better after rook fc8. But I didn't really want to go for this. I preferred queen to b6. And we just hold everything together and apply a ton of pressure. Queen d3, and we just kick the knight away. And then I take on e3, which is the best move. F takes e3. And the point is that rook takes, I thought I could take on b2, which I absolutely can. Because now if rook b1, I go queen to a3. And my queen is safe, right? And I'm just up a clean pawn. Also, if you take the queen, then I can take, because after this, I have queen to c2. And the queen does no longer sees the oh my god. No longer sees the c2 square, and I can escape. And I'm just up a clean pawn. So, f takes is the only move. I go bishop d7. Computer prefers bishop e8 for some reason. Maybe to go f6, bishop g6, which is an interesting idea. But it also likes queen to b3, which I played later. Here I rejected it on the basis of knight d2, in which case the computer wants to retreat. So I honestly don't understand that, because white could just repeat the position. So again, I don't really get why we're doing this. Queen b4, white can just repeat. I can't take because my queen gets trapped. I don't understand that. I think bishop d7 is perfectly fine. Queen d2. I'm going to go queen b3. Rook c4 is apparently a bit more accurate. Okay, why? Rook fc8, knight here. Rook, yeah, again, it wants to lift the rook to b4, which I didn't even consider. Which is such a cool idea, actually. Such a cool idea. But queen b3 is good. Rook e to c1. Bishop b4 is the best move. Knight e1. And here, I'm sure some of you are screaming at your computer screens, because I literally just missed bishop a4. If take, then I can take. And after take, I'm up way too much material. And if knight takes, then I just take. I completely missed the fact that I could just go ahead and take on a4. But I played rook c4. Slightly inaccurate. Knight d3. Which the computer says is an inaccuracy, but is actually the best move, so I don't know why it's saying that. And here we go bishop e7, which again it calls an inaccuracy, even though it says it's the best move. It also likes a5, though, which I considered, but I was like, well, after takes, a takes, let's say knight to e2, I didn't see how we were doing that much better in this position, because I was like, well, we're stuck with this light squared bishop, which kind of sucks, and we just traded off our good bishop. Computer doesn't really care, though. Oh, because it wants to take with a d pawn. Ah, well, that makes sense now. Our bishop's going to come alive very easily, and also this pawn is very scary. But okay, bishop e7 is still very good. Here, the best move for white is a5, in which case we just double up. And I mean, white is fighting for his life. His best idea is to try and shift the focus over here. But I just have bishop e8. I mean, you're not threatening f7. Although the computer does want to bring everything back, I think. h4, bishop f8, queen f4. And then b5? A takes, queen takes. Okay. But my opponent, of course, blunders his rook. And after takes, I actually did play the best move. I played rook f to c8. That's actually the best move. The computer wants knight c5 because it wants to take. And it thinks this is a brilliant move. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call it brilliant, because it's the only option. I mean, everything else doesn't seem to work. Oh, I can do this, to be fair. I completely missed that I could do that. But this is very good. D takes, and technically taking on e3 is slightly more accurate, but I took on c5, which is also very good. Knight to b1, I take and go queen c4. This is considered the mistake. Better is a move like d4. And if this, then we take here with check. So the queen can't abandon the knight. And if ed4, queen a4, queen c7, and then we take here with check. This would be mate, so the king has to come forward. And here we have mate in 11, apparently. Whatever. Queen b2 was played by my opponent because, of course, a queen trade, I calculated this. And I thought, well, I can go g5 and bring my king up to win the e5 pawn. That was my plan. And the knight just can't really do anything. I mean, if I want, I could even go bishop c6, completely restricting its forward movement, which I still don't have a good name for this concept. But queen b2, I go bishop c6, which is pretty obvious. Knight d2, queen to d3, applying a ton of pressure. And my opponent offers me a queen trade. The computer prefers queen a3, which I thought it would, but this is very simple. We go up 2 pawns, and we just bring the king in. And then I go bishop d1, which I was very happy with, completely restricting the knight's movement. Because we control these squares, and we control these squares. King to b4, I mean, my opponent tries to create counterplay, but there isn't really anything. We force another pawn through. We have connected past pawns here. These pawns are way too far away to do anything. Leaving a pawn on the starting square can be very good in these endgames, because it would take forever for these pawns to get far enough up the board to actually create a passed pawn. Whereas this pawn, for example, I can easily go b5 and trade it off immediately, creating a passed pawn very quickly. And also, I mean, our bishop is just stopping the movement anyway. So h4, we go e4, knight f1, and here we go pawn to d4, baiting out the move king c4, which would be a decent move, except as bishop e2 check. And I mean, you can win a couple pawns, but it's not enough. It's absolutely not enough. We have so many moves. Let's say bishop h3, stopping the advancement. The king can try and come into the position, I guess, but, I mean, it doesn't really matter. We can go pawn h5, lock this in, come over here, win the pawn, and throw these pawns forward. So a5, we go king d5, g4, we take on g4, and my opponent resigns because there's just nothing left to do. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it was a very useful game in the Caro Kann for you to learn from and enjoy. If you want to see another very interesting Caro Kann game, check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.